Climbing Green Mountain on Vancouver Island is never easy. But in recent years, it's gotten a lot tougher for Andrew Bryant, a biologist who has studied the Vancouver Island marmot for 14 years.
It's pretty hard for me to climb a lot of those hills and see nothing. It's like visiting a ghost town. Animals that you've tagged 10 or 11 years ago that you followed for that period of time, they become friends. And when you lose them, it's like losing an old friend.
And in this case, it's not just the old friends, but the entire species that's dying.
90% of the marmots that I studied for a decade are dead, and most of the colonies, they're gone. You don't look at that without saying to yourself, boy, I gotta do something. I gotta at least try.
Bryant was drawn to these mountains by a furry rodent that grows to about the size of a large house cat. He wanted to study their genetics, what makes them as different as they are from other species of marmot.
They're far more social than other marmot species. The population structure is quite different. It really is a different beast.
They were a good news species 14 years ago because they were burrowing homes in the massive clear-cuts shaved from the sides of these mountains.
The forest companies were really pleased. They could argue that they weren't disrupting or damaging marmot habitat. In fact, they were creating marmot habitat.
Like the marmots, the forest companies were fooled. For animals whose best defense mechanism is keen eyesight, the clear-cuts would become a death trap. Bryant's research showed that as the trees grew back, the marmots became easy targets for the more abundant predators at lower elevations.
Basically, from this vantage point, you can see pretty much every mountain that was occupied recently. So that big jagged one over there is Mount Arrowsmith. There was a colony.
On Arrowsmith, the last marmot sighting was 20 years ago. On Buttle Mountain, it was 4 years ago. Mount Hooper, 2 years ago.
One is that we had probably 300 animals living in this area 10 years ago, and now we've probably got about 20.
One by one, the colonies have been extinguished because of clear-cuts that kept young marmots from an age-old survival strategy, traveling from mountaintop to maintain a scattered, healthy population.
The whole system was glued together by the movements of half a dozen or 10 or 20 marmots that were moving in any given year. You only have to change the behavior of a handful of animals and you disrupt the entire system.
Bryant's research helped convince forest companies to chip in more than $1 million for the recovery effort, but he figures the marmots need public support too.
That was a Vancouver Island marmot.
There he is. An internet appeal brought a quick and often generous response.
When a child from Philadelphia goes out and does a car wash program for us and raises $100, people have really taken this thing to heart, and it gives me enormous satisfaction.
Bryant's Adopt a Marmot program has drawn pledges from around the world, and every dollar will be needed.
The support around the world is incredible. I could probably call Deborah and find out, but I think we're up to, I think it's 8,500 monthly donors now. How much have you ever seen them using this area in here, Malcolm?
Because as support has grown, marmot numbers continue to fall.
We're at the point where we're, rather than managing an entire population, we're managing the individual.
Malcolm McCady is a veterinarian who began volunteering for the program almost 10 years ago.
And there's a Vancouver Island marmot.
We have to look at each individual and what is best for that individual. Do we keep them where they are? Do we move them?
That's made McCady a kind of marmot matchmaker.
We had a solitary marmot. So essentially she was the last marmot on the mountain. And we had a male who'd actually left his natal colony. And so we actually put them into a tent. And so essentially we just left them in there overnight so they could get used to the sight of each other and the smell. And then we took them out and introduced them into a burrow. And they stayed down there for 4 hours. And
it's a great story.
Very quickly, you have a marmot in a bag.
But it reflects an awful truth. If people don't intervene, The species is history.
And here is a young of the year Vancouver Island marmot.
Like it or not, we're embarking on what is now the only hope for this species, which is, a long-term program of captive breeding and reintroduction. That's going to take a lot of money and a lot of time.
He's a little feistier too, so.
Over the past few years, the Marmot Recovery Program has taken a few young marmots and sent them to breeding programs in Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver.
Gotcha, little fellow. Oh, he's a tough one.
The litters those captive animals have had are reason for hope. There are now more marmots in the breeding program than there are left in the wild.
We've actually started with a far superior genetic fauning population than they had for whooping cranes, than they had for black-footed ferrets.
Another important piece of the recovery puzzle is taking shape on top of Mount Washington, on land donated by the ski hill.
There are still things we need to learn about behavior. There are still things we need to learn about what's the best way to introduce one marmot to another marmot.
This is literally the marmot's front yard. So once this breeding facility is built, the captive marmots can be fed the same grasses and live in the same climate as those in the wild. And that's critical.
They're at high elevations, and so they sleep for about 6.5 months of the year, hibernate for about 6.5 months of the year. Now, if we take them from Toronto and we release them, and that rhythm is not exact, essentially what's going to happen is they're going to die during hibernation.
It's easy to breed an animal in captivity, but really what we're after is breeding animals that have the behavior and the ecological skills to survive in the wild. And that's the hard part. But it's the long term, right?
For Bryant, 14 years of effort appear to be paying off. But even after the animals begin to be reintroduced in 2 or 3 years, if all goes well, the marmots may still need the occasional helicopter taxi ride.
As long as we continue to clear-cut log the forest, we're going to have marmots being intercepted by those clear-cuts and staying put instead of traveling to the more distant mountaintops. But there's nothing in the rules that says that a marmot has to arrive on that mountaintop naturally. It doesn't have to walk there. The goal of the recovery project is 600 or 800 marmots in 3 areas of Vancouver Island. Well, realistically speaking, that's going to take 15 or 20 years and millions of dollars. I have no doubt that we can do it. The question is, will we do it?
So Bryant has lots of mountains yet to climb.
What we are talking about here is not just a marmot. It's an incredible tale of survival and adaptation in the face of an incredibly harsh and difficult environment. I mean, it's just too good a story to lose.
For Country Canada, I'm Jim McQuarrie on Green Mountain on Vancouver Island.